A cold wind rushed across the cracked pavement as the sky threatened rain, and in that dim, late evening glow, a single father named Jonathan Hale, a well-known CEO who had once been praised for his ruthless business instincts, froze at the doorway of a small community shelter he funded but rarely visited. What stopped him was not the flickering bulb above the entrance, nor the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the city. It was the thin, trembling voice of a boy standing in the shadows, clutching the handles of an old wheelchair. And in that wheelchair, wrapped in a faded purple blanket, sat a girl whose face carried the silent pain of someone who had already lived through too much. The boy lifted his chin, swallowed hard, and asked the question that would rewrite the entire course of Jonathan's life. "Sir, my sister can't walk, can we stay with you?" That single sentence hit him harder than any corporate failure ever had. If you believe the world still becomes a better place when people choose kindness, compassion, and second chances, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps stories like these reach hearts that need them. Jonathan opened the shelter door fully, letting the hallway light spill out onto the children. For a brief moment he simply stared, struck by the boy's steadiness despite the fear in his eyes. The boy's name was Caleb, around 10 years old, and the girl, Sophie, maybe 7, small and fragile with thin arms tucked close to her body. Their clothes were worn, their shoes scuffed, and their faces carried the unmistakable exhaustion of children who had spent more nights outdoors than any child ever should. Jonathan had come to the shelter that evening to check in on renovations, maybe sign a few papers, and leave without getting involved. But nothing about these two children allowed him to take the easy path. Inside, the shelter was warm but crowded. Volunteers moved between families, handing out bags of toiletries and blankets. The air smelled faintly of detergent and tomato soup, and the walls were covered with drawings made by kids who had passed through the place over the years. Yet even in the bustle, the children's arrival created a subtle hush, as if the room itself recognized how much they needed help. Jonathan guided the wheelchair gently across the floor, noticing how Sophie winced when the wheels hit a small bump. Behind them, Caleb walked close, his hands trembling slightly, as though afraid to stray too far from his sister's side. Jonathan learned the children had been wandering for days. Their mother, overwhelmed and unwell, had disappeared. Their relatives were nowhere to be found. A neighbor had looked after them for a short while before finally sending them to the streets, unable to care for them any longer. But the part that caught in Jonathan's throat was when he realized Sophie couldn't stand because of a medical condition that had gone untreated far too long. The boy had pushed her wheelchair across half the town because he refused to abandon her. At 10 years old, Caleb had carried a responsibility heavier than most adults could handle. As Jonathan listened, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in him. For years he had lived inside the clean, sterile world of corporate meetings, polished reports, and an empty penthouse where the silence echoed far too loudly. Even with a son of his own, 8-year-old Matthew, he often felt like he was failing at being present, choosing work over afternoons in the park or school events he always promised to attend next time. But standing there, looking at Caleb and Sophie, he felt the sharp sting of clarity. He had been running from the parts of life that mattered most. He arranged a temporary room for them in the shelter, making sure Sophie had extra blankets and Caleb had a bedside lamp so he wouldn't be afraid of the dark. But the night didn't end there. Long after the volunteers left, Jonathan found himself sitting on a metal folding chair outside their room, unable to walk away. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face, brave, steady, unbroken despite everything. And he wondered how a child could carry so much courage when adults with more resources often looked the other way. Over the next few days, Jonathan returned to the shelter more than he had in years. He brought medical supplies, new clothes, and warm meals. Not as a CEO, not for publicity, but simply because he felt drawn to protect the children. Matthew joined him as well, shy at first but quickly growing attached to Caleb. The two boys would sit on the shelter floor playing with donated toy cars while Sophie watched with a soft smile. Jonathan watched them from the doorway, feeling a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain, something like a longing for a family rhythm he'd never quite managed to create on his own. But the shelter wasn't a solution. It was a temporary refuge. And one rainy afternoon, when Sophie developed a fever that left her pale and shaking, Jonathan realized he could no longer pretend he was a bystander. He rushed her to the hospital, Caleb gripping his hand the entire way, eyes wide with fear. The doctor spoke in terms he struggled to understand, mentioning spinal issues, delayed treatment, and surgeries that should have happened months ago. But they also said something else. Sophie had a chance, a real chance, if someone stepped in now. That night, in the quiet hospital room where machines hummed gently and rain tapped against the window, Caleb finally broke. He sat beside his sister's bed, head bowed, shoulders shaking. He whispered apologies for not being strong enough, for not saving her sooner, for all the nights they'd slept outside with no one to help. Jonathan placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, promising him he didn't have to carry this alone anymore. It was then, with heartbreaking relief in his eyes, that Caleb asked the question Jonathan already knew was coming. "Sir, can we stay with you? Not just tonight, but until she gets better." And Jonathan, a man who had mastered saying no to countless requests in boardrooms all his life, found that the only answer that felt right, the only answer his heart allowed, was yes. Bringing them into his home changed everything. The penthouse, once quiet and sterile, filled with life. Sophie's laughter echoed down the hallways whenever Matthew read her stories. Caleb learned to help Jonathan cook simple meals, proudly flipping pancakes or stirring soup while telling stories about the days before everything fell apart. Jonathan, in turn, began stepping away from work earlier, sometimes even canceling meetings, something no one ever believed he would do. His assistant was shocked, his board confused, but Jonathan didn't care. He finally understood what he had been missing all these years. Yet, change never comes without struggle. Some nights were difficult. Sophie's pain would flare, or Caleb would wake from nightmares, remembering the nights they had slept under old porches with nothing but a thin blanket. But every time, Jonathan was there. Sitting beside their beds until they fell asleep. Making promises he intended to keep. And slowly, the shadows in the children's eyes grew lighter. Months passed. Sophie went through surgeries, treatments, physical therapy. Caleb attended school again, finally getting the chance to be a kid instead of a protector forced to grow up too fast. Matthew learned to share his home, his toys, his family. And Jonathan, he rediscovered what it meant to love without fear. One crisp autumn afternoon, after months of hard work, the doctors allowed Sophie to take her first steps with assistance. It was in the hospital's physical therapy room, sunlight streaming through the windows as she stood with trembling legs, gripping the railings at her sides. Caleb's hands hovered near her back, ready to catch her if she fell. Jonathan and Matthew watched from the corner, tears threatening. Sophie took one step, then another, her face trembling with effort before breaking into a smile that lit up the whole room. It didn't matter that those steps were small. To them, they were a miracle. If this story is touching your heart so far, please consider supporting the channel by liking the video, leaving a comment, and sharing it so more people can experience stories filled with hope, healing, and love. Life moved forward. Papers were filed. Decisions were made. And one winter morning, after months of evaluations and home visits, Jonathan stood in a courtroom with Caleb holding one hand and Sophie holding the other. The judge smiled gently as she finalized the adoption, officially making the children part of his family. When Caleb turned and hugged him tightly, whispering, "Thank you for choosing us," Jonathan felt his heart break open in the best way possible.